comes to the future of our species, there's a fork in the road. Some would say too many are looking back at that fork over their shoulders as governments around the world frog march their populations and civilisations towards misery, hardship and destruction. I'm nowhere near as gloomy as that last sentence makes me sound, though. In fact, more than anything else, I'm simply incredulous at the pitch of the nonsense being applied by policymakers to have us submit to their ruinous plans. It's so obvious now, the dismantling of the good, the construction of the bad, as to be unmissable. I'll keep saying what I believe to be true, that there's nothing green about the green agenda, just plain old greed. The evidence is before our eyes, and more members of those put-upon populations are demanding answers to questions. Some may have passed that fork in the road, but there's still time to turn around. The hiding of the truth, the obscuring and withholding of facts is being pushed as our new normal. Sad to say, even when the truth is revealed, and more truth is revealed every day, too many find it too hard to look at. It's like a house infested with rats, but with the inhabitants finding the rats too hard to deal with and preferring to ignore the evidence all around. They keep their eyes closed instead. I see no rats, and so that must mean there are no rats. The lying is all around us, all the time. Living with lying, accepting lying, is another part of what is offered up as the new normal. In the novel Watership Down, the refugee rabbits find temporary respite in a warren filled with the saddest bunnies in England. There's plenty of food, but no joy whatsoever. The refugees learn the truth soon enough, that the sad rabbits have chosen to live in the knowledge the farmer has set snares, as well as piles of food. They can eat the free food, but they must accept they will be harvested at will. Rather than confront the truth, leave for pastures new perhaps, even if that meant less convenience, they turn blind eyes to what is right in front of them. I see no snares, they tell themselves, and so that must mean there are no snares. The biggest stick being wielded now by those driving the march along the road to nowhere is the claim our species is to blame for climate change, what they relentlessly refer to as a climate crisis. Having been browbeaten for decades, swathes of more than one generation has accepted our civilisations and ways of life must be surrendered, dismantled in the name of saving the earth. But then last year, an organisation called Clintel, the Climate Intelligence Foundation, published a document called the World Climate Declaration. It was signed by over 1,000 scientists and others from a scientific background. A Nobel Physics laureate was among them, and the declaration attracted huge attention on social media with its bold assertion that there is no climate emergency. The declaration also stated that, quote, Earth's climate has varied as long as the planet has existed, with natural cold and warm phases. The Little Ice Age ended as recently as 1850. Therefore, it's no surprise we're experiencing a period of warming. Needless to say, the declaration's signatories were roundly vilified and dismissed by the mainstream as having the wrong sort of scientific qualifications and were therefore not worth heeding. Based on extensive personal experience of the cancelling ways of the mainstream, I would say it was ever thus. But here we are at that fork in the road. Last week on this show, I asked my guests whether there are too many human beings alive on the planet or too few. That's the extent of the polarisation of the population debate, with all of us expected to pick one side and despise the other. I said last week, and I'll say again, that one camp or the other must be utterly wrong, and as a species we urgently need to know which would lead us down the road to ruin if we let them. If the population debate is dangerously split, then so too is that concerning climate, with one side insisting rising temperatures and sea levels promise our destruction, and the other saying nothing of the sort is true. Again, we need to know, and urgently, which camp has got it wrong, and it's no longer good enough just to watch dissenters being hounded out of polite society. That the mainstream media laps up the talk of a world on the point of spontaneously combusting, entirely because of activity by humans, makes it dangerously difficult to ask questions, far less seek truthful answers. I'd go so far as to say someone's lying about the climate, deliberately lying to the people and pushing a false narrative shaped to cause fear and assure mass compliance that serves the intentions of vested interests. Here in the UK, the Met Office has predicted the sea level could rise by nearly 4 feet by the end of the century, putting swathes of the country, including parts of London, under water. Other experts warn of sea level rises of 10 feet if the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica collapses. So far so catastrophic, and yet massive investment in property in London and in low-lying cities around the world continues unabated. What on earth are we to make of what might, bearing in mind mainstream predictions of wholesale flooding, be regarded as a level of recklessness by investors bordering on the insane? Actuaries calculate risk for insurance companies involved in mortgages and loans for such property investment. And yet none is calling a halt, writing off London, for example, as a suicidally bad risk, or New York, or other sea-level cities and locations around the world. The money men are not urging any imminent move away from the coast into higher ground inland. Last month, that same Clintel Foundation published damning analysis of the latest report from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the body to which most governments around the world look for climate policy advice. On the topic of predicted rises in sea level, the Clintel report says readings from tide gauges, kit for monitoring sea level, show, quote, remarkably linear behaviour for more than a century, unquote. Simply put, despite doom-laden predictions, the sea level has barely changed in the last 100 years. And while we, the general public, are being frightened out of our wits by disaster mongering, those with the deepest pockets of all seem, judging by their actions, to harbour no such worries. In 2017, climate crisis activist John Kerry spent $11.7 million on a sprawling estate on the beach in Martha's Vineyard. In 2020, Bill and Melinda Gates spent $43 million on a massive house on the beach in Del Mar near San Diego. The Obama family have their own luxurious beachfront home. When climate alarmist Al Gore, he of An Inconvenient Truth, ran for US president in 2000, he was apparently worth just $1.7 million. After decades of travelling the world in private jets to frighten the wits out of the proles, he has amassed an estimated $330 million. He owns multiple properties, including an ocean view home in Montecito, California, that he purchased in 2010 for nearly $9 million. Maybe those people are so wealthy they can contemplate watching such homes taken by the waves in their lifetimes, knowing they can afford to throw away tens of millions of dollars without consequence, without shedding a tear. But such contempt for sums beyond the reach of billions would hardly look good. The dear old IPCC also claims, quote, global temperatures are more likely than not unprecedented in the last 125,000 years. According to the Clintel Foundation, this ignores the well-documented event called the Holocene thermal maximum around 9,800 to 5,700 years ago, when evidence shows temperatures were often higher than now in many parts of the world. The IPCC ignores those inconvenient millennia altogether, as though they had never happened. Furthermore, according to Clintel, the IPCC ignored crucial peer-reviewed literature showing that normalised disaster losses have decreased since 1990, and that human mortality due to extreme weather has decreased by more than 95% since 1920. They continue, the IPCC, by cherry-picking from the literature, drew the opposite conclusions, claiming increases in damage and mortality due to anthropogenic climate change, which is to say caused by us humans. Clintel insists that the latest IPCC report rewrote climate history, emphasises an implausible worst-case scenario, has a huge bias in favour of bad news and against good news, and keeps the good news out of the summary for policymakers. Bear in mind, it's the summary for policymakers that governments like ours read and upon which base policies like net zero. Clintel claims to show biases and errors in every one of the IPCC report's 13 chapters. For example, a review article published in 2020 showed that 52 out of 53 peer-reviewed papers dealing with normalised disaster losses saw no increase in harms that could be attributed to climate change. The IPCC highlighted the single paper that claimed an increase in losses. That paper is unsurprisingly flawed, but its cherry-picking by the IPCC suggests they found its conclusions irresistible. But the IPCC's deafening contribution to the debate reaches the highest places. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, said recently, "We are on a highway to climate hell." The Clintel Foundation counters with, "An in-depth look at the mortality data shows that climate-related deaths are at an all-time low." What are we ordinary mortals supposed to make of all this? In a peer-reviewed paper in 2020, economist Bjorn Lomborg published data supporting an optimistic reading of the worldwide reduction of climate-related death, and yet the IPCC chose to ignore it. Clintel added, "The strategy of the IPCC seems to be to hide any good news about climate change and hype anything bad. The IPCC is addicted to its highest emissions scenario. In recent years, several papers have demonstrated that this scenario is implausible and should not be used for policy purposes." Deep inside the report, the IPCC acknowledges that this scenario has a low likelihood. This crucial remark, however, was not highlighted in the summary for policymakers, so that those important audiences were left unaware. It's the view of the Clintel Foundation that nothing less than the wholesale reform of the IPCC is now required, specifically to include alternative views. If, for some reason, such inclusion of different views is unacceptable, they say, the IPCC should be dismantled. If we really aren't in the midst of a climate crisis, if one road leads to the unnecessary dismantling of our civilization while the other leads to salvation, isn't it crucial that we pause for a moment to consider all the facts, not just those serving one side? It feels to me as though the world's populations have developed a dangerously high tolerance for lies. Like life forms that have adapted to live in an environment so toxic it should be lethal on contact, as with those that somehow survive on the seabed among vents spewing all manner of poisons, too many are oblivious to how much they're swallowing and breathing in. These are existential concerns that will determine the quality of the lives our children and grandchildren lead. If this mess of hopelessly polarised shouting matches is what passes for debate, if it's being driven and/or muddied not for the good of the many but for the enrichment and empowerment of the few, then those of us with voices must keep on demanding something much, much better. That's my opinion. You're free to disagree, of course you are. Keep your tweets and emails coming through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk and you can tweet me as well at gbnews, and I'll try to get to your comments later in the show. Joining me throughout is the ever